Hi everyone, this is Hardy. In this lecture we will look at some examples of artwork to see how we can go about lighting our face. So this is sort of lighting schemes for the face. Let's look at this example in the top left first of all. And for each example I've rendered a very simple grayscale sphere just to show where the light sources are coming from. Because really if you can understand how light is affecting this simple sphere shape, all you have to do is sort of expand that out to the more complex forms of the human face and body, and that's really all there is to it. So once you understand how this works, it's just a matter of applying this to a more complex shape. So as you can see on this guy, we've got a light source, the primary light source coming from the upper left, and the planes of his face and body that face this light source most directly are the highest value. So you can see here the shoulder, this part of his head, his cheekbone, and his jaw, and also parts of his neck. Those are the parts that are lit the most brightly, have the highest value. Same here on his arm on the far side. There are some cast shadows occurring because of this. You can see across this part of his chest and his arm, this light source is being blocked by his head, so we have a cast shadow, kind of like the cast shadow on the ground here that the sphere is casting. Another subtle one on the hand here. This part of his hand is blocking the light, creating that nice cast shadow that gives us more visual clues to describe the form. You can also see this reflected light, kind of the bounced light on the bottom right side. You can see I've got these cooler colored sort of bluish reflected lights happening on these planes that face in that direction. There's also one more very bright light source on the back of his head and shoulders. So another secondary light source. You can see it here on the fingers and the arm as well. Help define this as a very three-dimensional shape. Similarly, looking down below to this lady, again looking at her sphere, it's similar but a little bit different. Again, the planes of her face lit by this primary light source are the most bright, but I've also done some very intense secondary light sources, specifically this one lighting her forehead. And this one is actually sort of coming around the corner a little bit more than the first example. So that's why more of the forehead is lit with this bright light source, but still a very similar scheme. A primary light source, a reflected light that you can see here, and then a secondary light source to give it added interest. Moving over to this alien guy, similar thing, but much more subtle use of secondary light sources. Basically, the primary light source does just about the whole job for us. The forehead, cheekbones, and this part of where I guess the nose would normally be, those planes are facing this primary light source, so they are the planes that are lit most brightly, and that's what gives us this nice illusion of a three-dimensional form. And it gets darker as it wraps around this round shape, just like in this sphere. It's just a more complex shape. So a light side fading gradually to a dark side, our core shadow, and then we have some reflected lights here as well. They're subtle on this guy, but they are there. Moving up to this friendly looking guy with a cigar, very similar thing. Primary light source lighting these areas of his forehead, nose, and cheek most brightly because those planes are facing up to the light source. I've got a few secondary light sources here, a bright one on either side of the head, so I've indicated those here on the sphere. And he's also got a little bit of light coming off of this cigar. So applying it to the sphere, there's just a little bright spot right there and some bright edge lighting around the outside, and that gives his face a really nice three-dimensional form. But looking at this primary light source, you can see it's a little bit right of center, so this side of his face is kind of the light side, and it gradually gets a little darker as it goes to the left. One thing I'd like to point out is this area where light starts to turn to shadow is where you see all of these wrinkles and little craggy features most prominently. It's often referred to as the halftone, but this area where light turns into dark is where you can really see some nice contrast, and all these interesting wrinkles of the face can really pop. So a good opportunity to define your form further in that halftone area. Finally, going down to the bottom, this one's very basic as well. A primary light source lighting these planes facing us most brightly. There's also some very bright secondary light sources on either side of the head. One interesting thing about this one is why I included it, is there's one that doesn't really fit into any of these categories. This is, I sometimes call it a transmitted light, or three-dimensional modelers call it subsurface scattering. It's where light shining on the back of a thin-skinned area like the ear or some of the webbing of the hands, you'll see this bright red glow kind of shine through. It's actually light going through the skin and bouncing around underneath the surface. It's a really cool thing to try and include on organic forms. It gives them an extra organic feel to them. You can see I did that on this guy as well, and to an extent on this one too. So adding a nice glow behind ears when you can, when the lighting scheme will allow it, is a nice little detail to add. So that's the basic idea behind lighting the face. If you can just understand it simply as a three-dimensional form, then you'll know just how light should behave, and it'll look very realistic. So I hope you find this helpful moving forward.